Hello everyone. I am Shubha Hiremat, Assistant Professor of English, Government First Grade College, Dharwad. In this session, we will try to know the life and works of William Wordsworth, who is the author of the poem "The World is Too Much with Us." Students, William Wordsworth is one of the greatest English poets, and he belonged to 19th century England. He is the pioneer of romantic poetry in English literature. Romanticism was basically a literary and artistic movement that originated during the late 18th century in Europe. The movement saw artists from various walks of life, like painters, writers, poets, musicians, etc. It glorified the subtleties and beauty of nature, emotions, and the past. Romanticism saw the birth of a new genre of poetry, which was later called as Romantic poetry. This period between the late 1780s and 1790s until the 1850s came to be known as the Romantic Age. They are also called as 19th century poets or nature poets. They revolted against the poetic tradition of 18th century and turned to the nature. Romantic poetry mainly focused on imagination, emotions, originality, and freedom in their poetry. Romantic poets are divided into two groups, the first generation and the second generation. William Wordsworth belonged to the first generation of Romantic poetry along with S.T. Coleridge, Robert Southey, and Scott. The second generation of Romantic poetry includes Byron, Shelley, and Keats. William Wordsworth was born on April 7, 1770 at Cockermouth, Cumberland, in the Lake District of northern England. He was the second of 5 children of a modestly prosperous estate manager. He lost his mother when he was 7 and his father when he was 13, upon which the orphan boys were sent off by guardian uncles to a grammar school at Hawkshead, a village in the heart of the Lake District. At Hawkshead, Wordsworth received an excellent education in classics, literature, and mathematics. But the chief advantage to him there was the chance to indulge in the boyhood pleasures of living and playing in the outdoors. The natural scenery of the English lakes could terrify as well as nurture, as Wordsworth would later testify in the line, "I grew up fostered alike by nature and by fear." Wordsworth moved on in 1787 to St. John's College, Cambridge. Wordsworth took his BA degree on January 27, 1791 and quit Cambridge without no fixed intentions as to his future career. Repelled by the competitive pressures there, he elected to idle his way through the university. The most important thing he did in his college years was to devote his summer vacation in 1790 to a long walking tour through revolutionary France. There he was caught up in the passionate enthusiasm that followed the fall of the Bastille and became an ardent Republican sympathizer. He returned in 1791 to France, where he formed a passionate attachment to a French woman, Annette Vallon. But before their child was born in December 1792, Wordsworth had to return to England and was cut off there by the outbreak of war between England and France. He was not to see his daughter Caroline until she was 9. Earlier, he was inspired by the French Revolution, and his most often quoted was, "Bliss was it in those days to be alive, but to be young was very heaven." But then followed Reign of Terror. The 3 or 4 years that followed his return to England were the darkest of Wordsworth's life. Unprepared for any profession, rootless, virtually penniless, bitterly hostile to his own country's opposition to the France, he lived in London in the company of radicals like William Godwin and learned to feel a profound sympathy for the abandoned mothers, beggars, children, vagrants, and victims of England's wars, who began to march through the somber poems he began writing at this time. This darkest period ended in 1795, when a friend's legacy made possible Wordsworth's reunion with his beloved sister Dorothy. His dreams and the early enthusiasm of French Revolution was now shattered, and he was disillusioned. While living with Dorothy at Alfoxden House, Wordsworth began friends with a fellow poet, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It was a turning point in the life of both these poets. They formed a partnership that would change both poets' lives and alter the course of English poetry. In 1799, he moved to Grasmere in Lake District. Wordsworth married Mary Hutchinson in 1802. Wordsworth succeeded his friend Robert Southey as Britain's Poet Laureate in 1843 and held that post until his own death in 1850. Major works of William Wordsworth. Stimulated by Coleridge and under the healing influence of nature and his sister Dorothy, Wordsworth began in 1797 to 98 to compose the short lyrical and dramatic poems for which he is best remembered by many readers. With collaboration with Coleridge, they composed a collection of poems called Lyrical Ballads. The first edition of Lyrical Ballads was published in 1798, and it marked the beginning of Romantic Age. Some of these poems were affectionate tributes to Dorothy, some were tributes to daffodils, birds, and other elements of nature's holy plan, and some were portraits of simple rural people intended to illustrate basic truths of human nature. Many of these short poems were written to original program formulated jointly by Wordsworth and Coleridge and aimed at breaking the decorum of neoclassical verse. lyrical ballads opened with Coleridge's long poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and closed with Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey. All but three of the intervening poems were Wordsworth's, and as he declared in a preface to second edition 2 years later, their object was to choose incidents and situations from common life and to relate or describe them in a selection of language really used by men. Most of the poems were dramatic in form, designed to reveal the character of the speaker. In the second edition of Lyrical Ballads, it contained famous preface, the Manifesto of English Romanticism. In this, he elaborates his poetic theory. The third edition was published in 1803 and fourth in 1805. As early as 1798, Wordsworth began to talk in grand terms of his poem, to be entitled The Recluse. To nerve himself up to this enterprise and to test his powers, Wordsworth began writing the autobiographical poem that would absorb him intermittently for the next 40 years, and which was eventually published in 1850 under the title The Prelude, or Growth of a Poet's Mind. The Prelude was published posthumously. It extends the quite autobiographical mode of reminiscence that Wordsworth had begun in his poem Tintern Abbey. It traces poet's life from his school days through his university life and his visits to France up to the year in which he settled at Grasmere. It thus describes a circular journey which has been called a long journey home. But the main events in the autobiography are internal. The poem exultantly describes the ways in which imagination emerges as the dominant faculty, exerting its control over the reason and the world of the senses alike. The Recluse was never completed, and only one of its three projects parts was actually written. This was published in 1814 as The Excursion and consisted of 9 long philosophical monologues spoken by pastoral characters. It was composed in blank verse. This bleak narrative records the slow, pitiful decline of a woman whose husband had gone off to the army and never returned. For later versions of this poem added a reconciling conclusion, but the earliest and the most powerful vision was sparkly tragic. Wordsworth's influence was felt throughout the rest of the 19th century, though he was honored more for his smaller poems as singled out by the Victorian critic Matthew Arnold than for his masterpiece The Prelude. Wordsworth is also known as a critic who established his own theory of poetry. The famous definition of poetry given by Wordsworth is that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of emotions recollected in tranquility. He says poetry is not dependent on rhetorical and literary devices, but is a free expression of poet's thought and feeling. The poet is a teacher and must strive to reveal truth through an imaginative awareness of persons and things. According to Wordsworth, poet must communicate his ideas and emotions through a powerful recreation of the original experience. For this, he must have a sensibility far beyond that of the ordinary individual. Thus, as he engaged with his changing world, both its challenges and its exciting new possibilities, William Wordsworth is still relevant for 21st century readers. He anticipates some of the concerns at the heart of our own, about the health of the environment, about the question of our relationship with other non-human life forms, and about how our lives are interconnected with the world of nature. Wordsworth is rightly regarded as the greatest nature poet. He expresses the beauty of nature and the therapeutic feature in his poems. His poetry navigates the complex changes in his own historic movement. It also yields insights that are remarkably pertinent to our own 21st century spot of time. One of the famous poems of William Wordsworth, "The world is too much with us," is relevant for the present time, and the theme of the poem is greatly affected, and it can be read and reread to understand the human nature and the value of this life. Thus, I will conclude my lecture on the life and works of William Wordsworth, and in this next session we will learn the poem, that is, "The world is too much with us." Thank you.